This historical account examines Sultan Murad I's systematic campaigns to subjugate the fragmented Serbian principalities during the 1370s and 1380s, a critical period when Ottoman military pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic exploitation of Serbian political divisions gradually transformed independent Christian Serbian rulers into Ottoman vassals. We'll explore how the catastrophic Serbian defeat at the Battle of Maritsa in 1371 created the conditions for Ottoman expansion into Serbian territories, how Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović emerged as the most powerful Serbian leader while ultimately accepting vassal status to preserve his principality, how the competing Serbian nobles' inability to unite against the Ottoman threat facilitated Turkish dominance, and how this period of imposed vassalage set the stage for the climactic Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where open conflict would resume with devastating consequences. Through 7 detailed parts, we'll witness the complex dynamics of medieval Balkan politics, the sophisticated Ottoman strategies for expansion to a combination of military force and diplomatic pressure, and the human experiences of populations caught between resistance and accommodation as their world transformed from Serbian independence to Ottoman suzerainty. 1372 dawned across the Serbian lands with a political landscape fundamentally transformed by the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Maritsa the previous September, where the massive Serbian army led by King Vukašin, Mr. Naftov Edžević, and his brother Despot Okoša had been annihilated in a devastating Ottoman night attack that killed both commanders along with perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 Serbian warriors, destroying the largest military force that the fragmented Serbian state could assemble and eliminating any realistic possibility of successful military resistance to Ottoman expansion in the immediate future. Sultan Murad I, having demonstrated through this spectacular victory that Ottoman military capabilities far exceeded what any Balkan Christian power could effectively challenge, now turned his strategic attention to the Serbian principalities whose geographic positions south of the Danube and east of the Adriatic made them logical targets for Turkish expansion, and whose political fragmentation following the death of the powerful Emperor Stefan Dušan in 1355 created opportunities for Ottoman diplomatic pressure to exploit divisions between competing Serbian nobles who prioritized personal power over collective defense against the existential Ottoman threat. The Serbian territories that had escaped direct involvement in the Maritsa disaster, particularly the principality governed by Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović in the central Serbian regions around Kruševac, faced agonizing strategic calculations about whether to resist Ottoman pressure through military means that the recent catastrophe had demonstrated would likely fail, to accept vassal status that might preserve Serbian autonomy under Turkish suzerainty, or to seek external assistance from Christian powers whose support had proven disappointingly inadequate, despite urgent appeals and despite the obvious implications that Ottoman domination of the Balkans held for broader European security. The political fragmentation that characterized Serbian territories during the 1370s reflected the progressive disintegration of the Serbian Empire that Stefan Dušan had created during his reign from 1331 to 1355. When Serbian power had expanded dramatically to encompass Macedonia, Albania, Thessaly, and extensive territories that challenged Byzantine authority and that made Serbia the dominant Balkan power capable of projecting influence throughout southeastern Europe. Dušan's death, without establishing clear succession mechanisms or sustainable administrative structures to govern the diverse territories he had conquered, initiated a process of imperial fragmentation, as powerful regional nobles asserted independence, as different claimants competed for imperial authority, and as external pressures from Hungarian, Byzantine, and increasingly Ottoman forces exploited Serbian weakness to expand at Serbian expense. By the early 1370s, the nominal Serbian Emperor Uroš the Weak exercised minimal real authority beyond limited territories directly under his control, while actual power resided with regional lords including Prince Lazar in central Serbia, the Balashik family controlling territories in Zeta along the Adriatic coast, Vuk Branković governing regions in Kosovo and Macedonia, and various other nobles who maintained effective independence, while theoretically acknowledging some form of Serbian imperial suzerainty that had become essentially meaningless in practical political terms. Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović's emergence as the most powerful Serbian nobleman following the Maritsa catastrophe reflected both his military capabilities, demonstrated through the successful defense of his territories against various threats, and his political acumen in navigating the treacherous landscape of Serbian noble competition while building alliances and maintaining legitimacy through marriage connections to the Serbian royal family. Lazar had risen to prominence through a combination of military service, strategic marriages, including his own union with Milica, a princess from the Serbian royal house, and careful cultivation of relationships with the Serbian Orthodox Church, whose support provided religious legitimacy that compensated for his lack of direct royal bloodline. His principality, centered on Kruševac and encompassing some of the most economically productive Serbian territories, provided resources that enabled him to maintain substantial military forces. At the same time, his geographic position in central Serbia placed him at the crossroads of competing powers and threats that required sophisticated diplomatic skills alongside military capability. The prince's recognition that Serbian survival required both military preparedness and diplomatic flexibility would shape his response to Ottoman pressure during the critical years following Maritsa, when the balance between resistance and accommodation would determine whether Serbian independence could be preserved or whether Ottoman vassalage represented the best achievable outcome. The Ottoman strategic approach to Serbian territories following the Maritsa victory demonstrated Sultan Murad's sophisticated understanding that complete military conquest was not the only, or necessarily the most efficient means of extending Turkish dominance. His vassal relationships could achieve strategic objectives including tribute revenues, military support for Ottoman campaigns, and prevention of anti-Ottoman coalitions while minimizing the administrative and military costs of direct governance over Christian populations whose incorporation into the Ottoman Empire might generate resistance requiring expensive suppression efforts. The Sultan recognized that Serbian political fragmentation created opportunities for applying diplomatic and military pressure selectively against individual Serbian rulers who lacked the unified support necessary for effective resistance, enabling Ottoman authorities to negotiate favorable vassal arrangements with each Serbian nobleman separately rather than confronting a coordinated Serbian coalition that might have presented more formidable opposition. The Ottoman diplomatic missions that Sultan Murad dispatched to various Serbian courts during 1372 and subsequent years combined offers of reasonable vassal terms with implicit or explicit military threats, creating psychological pressure that made acceptance of Ottoman suzerainty appear as pragmatic accommodation to irresistible force rather than as shameful capitulation, while also demonstrating that rulers who accepted vassal status would be treated more favorably than those who resisted and who would face the full force of Ottoman military power that the Maritsa victory had so dramatically demonstrated. The military operations that Ottoman forces conducted along Serbian frontiers during the early 1370s served primarily to demonstrate Turkish military capability and to create pressure that reinforced diplomatic efforts rather than to achieve immediate territorial conquest. As Sultan Murad recognized that the psychological impact of Ottoman military presence combined with memories of the Maritsa catastrophe could accomplish strategic objectives without requiring costly campaigns. The Ottoman cavalry raids that penetrated Serbian territories, striking at isolated fortresses and vulnerable communities before withdrawing, demonstrated that Serbian defenses could not prevent Turkish forces from operating throughout the region, and created a climate of insecurity that undermined confidence in Serbian rulers' ability to protect their subjects. The siege operations that Ottoman forces occasionally conducted against strategically located Serbian fortresses demonstrated Turkish technical capabilities, while also providing opportunities for Serbian commanders to witness firsthand the sophisticated siege warfare methods that Ottoman engineers employed, creating realistic assessments of how futile prolonged resistance would prove if Sultan Murad decided to commit serious military resources to conquering Serbian territories. These military demonstrations, combined with diplomatic offers of vassal arrangements that would preserve Serbian autonomy under Ottoman suzerainty, created a strategic environment where acceptance of Turkish demands appeared rational rather than cowardly. The Serbian responses to Ottoman pressure varied considerably depending on individual nobles' geographic positions relative to Turkish military power, their assessments of their own military capabilities, their political relationships with other Serbian rulers, and their personalities and strategic philosophies regarding whether resistance or accommodation better served their interests and their subjects' welfare. The Serbian nobles whose territories bordered Ottoman-controlled regions in Macedonia and southern Serbia faced immediate pressure that made their strategic choices particularly urgent and constrained, as Ottoman military operations could readily target their lands while their geographic isolation from other Serbian principalities limited their access to potential Allied support. The Serbian rulers governing territories more distant from immediate Ottoman military reach possessed greater freedom to adopt resistant postures, though they also recognized that geographic distance provided only temporary insulation from Turkish pressure that would eventually reach their domains if Ottoman expansion continued. The resulting pattern saw some Serbian nobles accepting vassal status relatively quickly after receiving Ottoman diplomatic overtures backed by military demonstrations. while others attempted to maintain independence through various strategies including defensive military preparations, diplomatic appeals for external Christian assistance, and efforts to coordinate resistance among multiple Serbian principalities that consistently failed because of the political divisions and competing ambitions that prevented effective Serbian unity. The role of the Serbian Orthodox Church in shaping Serbian responses to Ottoman pressure proved significant, though complex, as church leaders faced tensions between religious duty to resist Muslim domination of Christian territories and pragmatic recognition that futile military resistance would result in destruction and suffering without achieving any realistic possibility of preserving Serbian independence against overwhelming Ottoman military superiority. The Serbian church hierarchy, led by the Serbian Patriarch and including numerous influential bishops and abbots of important monasteries, possessed moral authority that Serbian secular rulers respected and that could influence popular attitudes toward Ottoman pressure and toward their own rulers' responses to Turkish demands. The church leaders generally advocated for Serbian unity against the Ottoman threat and encouraged military preparedness. Yet they also recognized that preservation of Serbian Christian communities and religious institutions required pragmatic accommodation when military resistance appeared certain to fail. The complex position that Serbian Orthodox clergy navigated, attempting to maintain religious and moral principles while also ensuring institutional survival under circumstances where Ottoman dominance appeared increasingly inevitable, would shape how Serbian populations understood and responded to their rulers' decisions regarding vassalage and resistance during this critical period. 1373 through 1375 witnessed the systematic application of Ottoman pressure against the southernmost Serbian territories that bordered Ottoman-controlled Macedonia and Thrace most directly, as Sultan Murad employed combined military and diplomatic campaigns designed to bring these vulnerable Serbian principalities under Turkish suzerainty before advancing attention to the more powerful and geographically protected Serbian rulers, including Prince Lazar. Her subjugation would require more substantial efforts. The Serbian nobles governing territories in Kosovo, southern Serbia, and the borderlands adjacent to Ottoman domains faced the full weight of Turkish military capability deployed through raids, sieges, and demonstrations of force that made clear the futility of military resistance, while Ottoman diplomatic representatives simultaneously offered vassal terms that promised preservation of Serbian governance, protection of Christian religious practices, and security from further military operations in exchange for acknowledgement of Ottoman suzerainty, annual tribute payments, and military support for Turkish campaigns. The progressive submission of these southern Serbian territories to Ottoman vassalage during the mid-13th century established patterns and precedents that would shape subsequent Ottoman dealings with other Serbian rulers, while also demonstrating to the broader Serbian political world that Turkish dominance was expanding systematically and that resistance appeared increasingly futile, regardless of individual courage or local military capabilities. Fragmented strategic position as ruler of extensive territories in Kosovo and parts of Macedonia placed him among the Serbian nobles most immediately vulnerable to Ottoman pressure following the Maritsa catastrophe, as his lands bordered regions where Ottoman forces operated regularly and where Turkish military superiority could be readily demonstrated through operations launched from nearby Ottoman bases. Fragmented, who had built his power through combination of military prowess, strategic marriages including his union to Prince Lazar's daughter Mara that connected him to the most powerful Serbian princely family, and careful political maneuvering through the complex Serbian noble rivalries, confronted difficult strategic choices about whether to resist Ottoman pressure through military means that appeared unlikely to succeed or to accept vassal status that would preserve his territories and position while acknowledging Turkish suzerainty. The prince's initial attempts to maintain independence through defensive military preparations and through diplomatic efforts to coordinate resistance with other Serbian rulers consistently encountered the harsh reality that Ottoman military capability far exceeded what Serbian forces could match, and that Serbian political divisions prevented the kind of unified resistance that might have presented more formidable opposition to Turkish expansion. The vassal negotiations that various Serbian nobles conducted with Ottoman representatives during the mid-13th century revealed the sophisticated diplomatic framework that Sultan Murad's administration had developed for managing relationships with subordinate Christian rulers, creating standardized yet flexible arrangements that could be adapted to specific circumstances while maintaining core Ottoman strategic interests. The typical vassal agreement required Serbian rulers to acknowledge Sultan Murad as their suzerain through formal diplomatic protocols and through symbolic acts of submission, to pay annual tribute calculated based on their territory's populations and economic productivity, to provide military contingents of specified sizes when Ottoman authorities requested support for Turkish campaigns, to coordinate foreign policies with Ottoman strategic interests by refraining from alliances that might threaten Turkish power, and to permit Ottoman officials to establish presence in key Serbian cities for facilitating communication and monitoring compliance with treaty obligations. In exchange, vassal agreements guaranteed that Serbian rulers would retain their thrones and governance authority over internal affairs, that Christian Orthodox religious practices would be protected and church properties respected, that Ottoman military forces would not conduct operations in vassal territories as long as treaty obligations were fulfilled, and that Ottoman power would protect vassal rulers against threats from other powers, including rival Serbian nobles, whose aggression the Ottomans would help suppress. According to historical analysis presented in The Fall of Medieval Serbia and the Reign of Sultan Bajazet I, published in the Slavonic and East European Review, these Ottoman vassal arrangements represented sophisticated statecraft that achieved Turkish strategic objectives while minimizing administrative and military costs, creating incentives for Serbian cooperation through a combination of threats and rewards that made acceptance of Ottoman suzerainty appear rational for Serbian rulers seeking to preserve their positions and protect their subjects from warfare's devastations. The vassal system enabled Sultan Murad to extend Ottoman dominance throughout the Balkans without requiring direct military conquest and administrative integration of every Christian territory, creating hierarchical relationships that maintained Ottoman supremacy while preserving local governance structures that could manage routine affairs without requiring extensive Turkish administrative involvement. The military contingents that Serbian vassals were obligated to provide for Ottoman campaigns represented one of the most significant practical consequences of vassal status, as Serbian warriors who had previously defended their homeland against Ottoman expansion now found themselves required to fight alongside Turkish forces in campaigns that might target other Christian territories, including Serbian principalities that had not yet submitted to Ottoman vassalage. The Serbian military units that joined Ottoman armies under these vassal obligations typically numbered several hundred to several thousand warriors, depending on the vassal state's size and military resources, providing the Ottoman military establishment with additional manpower that augmented Turkish forces while also serving Ottoman political purposes by demonstrating Serbian subordination through their visible participation in Turkish military operations. The Serbian warriors who served in these campaigns faced profound moral dilemmas about fighting for Muslim Ottoman interests against fellow Christians. Yet they also understood that their service protected their own communities from Ottoman military operations that would be far more devastating than the obligations that vassal status imposed, creating pragmatic calculations that prioritized survival and protection of their families over abstract principles of Christian solidarity or national independence. Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović's response to Ottoman pressure during the mid-13th century demonstrated both his military capability to resist Turkish expansion more effectively than weaker Serbian nobles and his pragmatic recognition that ultimate Serbian survival required diplomatic accommodation despite his personal preferences for maintaining complete independence. Lazar's principality, centered in the Serbian heartland and benefiting from relatively defensible terrain and from economic resources that enabled maintenance of substantial military forces, possessed greater capacity for resistance than the southern Serbian territories that had submitted to Ottoman vassalage during 1373 through 1375. The prince's military preparations included strengthening fortifications at key defensive positions, maintaining trained military forces at readiness, and cultivating alliances with other Serbian nobles who retained independence from Ottoman control, creating defensive capabilities that made immediate Ottoman conquest of his territories more costly than Sultan Murad apparently judged worthwhile during this period, when Turkish strategic attention remained partly focused on consolidating control over recently conquered Bulgarian territories and on managing other frontier regions where Ottoman expansion continued. The diplomatic correspondence between Prince Lazar and Sultan Murad during the mid to late 1370s, preserved in fragmentary form in various Serbian monasteries and Ottoman archives, reveal of the careful negotiation to which both rulers attempted to manage their relationship, while avoiding immediate military confrontation that neither apparently desired at that moment. Lazar's communications to the Sultan employed respectful language that acknowledged Ottoman power while carefully avoiding explicit submission or acknowledgement of vassal status, creating an ambiguous diplomatic position that left open possibilities for future accommodation while maintaining Serbian dignity and avoiding the kind of clear subordination that other Serbian nobles had accepted. Sultan Murad's responses combined expressions of respect for Lazar's position as a powerful Serbian ruler with implicit reminders of Ottoman military superiority and expectations that Serbian cooperation with Turkish strategic interests would be prudent. creating diplomatic pressure without immediately forcing confrontation that might require costly military operations to resolve. This diplomatic dance, maintaining productive communication while postponing definitive resolution of their political relationship, would continue through much of the 1370s until circumstances would force more explicit arrangements. The economic impact of Ottoman expansion and the progressive Serbian submission to vassal status affected Serbian territories through multiple mechanisms, including the tribute obligations that vassalage imposed, the disruption of traditional trade patterns as Ottoman control of surrounding regions altered commercial relationships, and the general economic uncertainty that political subordination and constant military pressure created even in territories that maintained nominal independence. The tribute payments that Serbian vassal states owed to Sultan Murad represented substantial economic burdens that required Serbian rulers to extract additional tax revenues from their subjects, creating hardships and resentments that complicated relationships between Serbian nobles and their populations, while also demonstrating the material costs that Ottoman dominance imposed beyond purely political subordination. The commercial disruptions that occurred as Ottoman expansion altered traditional Balkan trade routes, and as Turkish merchants increasingly dominated commerce in regions under Ottoman control affected Serbian merchants and artisans whose livelihoods depended on stable commercial networks, creating economic pressures that sometimes made Serbian populations view Ottoman vassalage as acceptable or even preferable to continued warfare and instability that disrupted economic activity more severely than tributary obligations. 1376 through 1378 witnessed Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović's emergence as the undisputed leader of the Serbian principalities that maintained effective independence from direct Ottoman vassalage. As the prince's military successes in defending his territories, his diplomatic skills in managing relationships with both Ottoman authorities and other Serbian nobles, and his cultivation of Serbian Orthodox Church support created political and moral authority that transcended his actual territorial holdings, and that positioned him as the symbolic, if not legal, leader of Serbian resistance to complete Ottoman domination. Lazar's military campaigns during this period combined defensive operations that protected his principality against Ottoman raids and against aggressive Serbian rivals with limited offensive actions. That demonstrated his military capability, and that enhanced his reputation among Serbian populations seeking leadership that might preserve some measure of Serbian independence, despite the overwhelming Ottoman pressure that had already subordinated much of the Balkans. The prince's careful balance between military preparedness that deterred immediate Ottoman conquest and diplomatic engagement that maintained functional relationships with Sultan Murad demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking that recognized both the necessity of showing strength to be taken seriously and the futility of direct military confrontation with Ottoman forces whose capabilities far exceeded what any individual Serbian principality could match. The Battle of Dubrovnica in 1378, though a relatively modest engagement compared to major battles like Maritsa or the later Kosovo confrontation, nonetheless held significant symbolic importance as a demonstration of Serbian military capability when properly led and organized, providing morale boost to Serbian populations demoralized by years of Ottoman pressure and progressive submission of Serbian territories to Turkish vassalage. The battle occurred when Ottoman forces, possibly acting in support of one of Lazar's Serbian rivals or possibly conducting independent raiding operations, entered territories that Lazar claimed, prompting the prince to mobilize his forces and confront the Turkish incursion in an engagement that resulted in Serbian victory and Ottoman withdrawal. The military significance of Dubrovnica proved limited, as the Ottoman forces involved represented a relatively small portion of Sultan Murad's available military power, and the engagement did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance that remained overwhelmingly favorable to Ottoman interests. Yet the symbolic impact of demonstrating that Serbian forces could defeat Ottoman troops in battle, however modest the Turkish force involved, and however limited the strategic consequences, provided psychological benefits that strengthened Lazar's position as Serbian leader, and that momentarily suggested that determined resistance might achieve some success against the Turkish advance, that had appeared inexorable since the Maritsa catastrophe. The church council that Prince Lazar convened at Pick in 1377 brought together Serbian Orthodox bishops, important monastic leaders, and Serbian secular nobles to discuss responses to Ottoman pressure, and to seek religious guidance and legitimization for whatever course Serbian leadership might adopt regarding the fundamental question of resistance versus accommodation with Turkish power. The church assembly, meeting at Pick Monastery that served as the seat of the Serbian Orthodox Patriarchate, deliberated about theological and practical dimensions of living under Muslim Ottoman rule, about the obligations that Christian rulers owed to defend their faith, and their flocks against infidel domination, and about the pragmatic realities that overwhelming Ottoman military superiority and Serbian political fragmentation created regarding realistic strategic options. The Council's conclusions, while emphasizing the religious importance of preserving Orthodox Christianity and Serbian cultural identity, also acknowledged that futile military resistance destroying Serbian communities and churches served no divine purpose, essentially providing religious sanction for pragmatic accommodation with Ottoman power, when military resistance appeared clearly hopeless, while maintaining principle that Serbian rulers should preserve maximum autonomy and should protect Christian religious practice to the greatest extent possible under whatever political arrangements circumstances imposed. The marriage alliances that Prince Lazar arranged during the late 1370s demonstrated his sophisticated use of family connections to build political networks among Serbian nobility, while also creating personal relationships with other Balkan Christian rulers whose support might prove valuable in managing Ottoman pressure or in coordinating resistance if circumstances permitted. Lazar's arrangement of his daughter Mara's marriage to the Brankovic, the powerful Serbian noble controlling Kosovo and parts of Macedonia, created a family alliance between two of the most significant Serbian principalities that remained outside direct Ottoman vassalage, theoretically strengthening their combined position, while also creating potential complications if their interests diverged or if one accepted Ottoman vassalage while the other resisted. The prince's diplomatic relationships with rulers of Bosnia, with Bulgarian princes who maintained some autonomy despite Ottoman pressure, and with various other Balkan Christian authorities, created networks that might facilitate coordination if opportunities for effective resistance emerged, while also providing channels for sharing intelligence about Ottoman intentions and capabilities that could inform Serbian strategic planning. The fortification program that Prince Lazar implemented throughout his territories during the late 1370s reflected his recognition that military preparedness provided an essential foundation for maintaining Serbian independence, or at minimum for negotiating favorable vassal terms if accommodation with Ottoman power became unavoidable. The prince directed substantial resources towards strengthening existing fortresses and constructing new defensive positions at strategically crucial locations that could control access routes into his territories, creating military infrastructure that would make Ottoman conquest costly even if ultimately successful. The fortification investment served multiple purposes, including practical military defense, psychological deterrence by demonstrating Serbian determination to resist conquest, and political signaling to Sultan Murad that, while Lazar might eventually accept vassal status if terms were sufficiently favorable, the prince possessed the capability and will to make military conquest expensive enough that negotiated settlement would better serve Ottoman interests than forcible subjugation. This strategic use of military preparation as a component of diplomatic positioning demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how military capabilities could enhance negotiating positions even when direct military confrontation appeared inadvisable. The intelligence networks that Prince Lazar maintained to monitor Ottoman military activities, to track movements and dispositions of Turkish forces, and to gather information about Sultan Murad's strategic intentions proved crucial for enabling Serbian defensive planning and for providing early warning of potential Ottoman operations that might target Lazar's territories. The intelligence gathering combined information from Serbian merchants who traveled through Ottoman-controlled territories and who could observe and report on Turkish military preparations, from Serbian nobles who had accepted Ottoman vassalage and who sometimes provided intelligence about Ottoman plans to relatives or allies who remained independent, from church networks that maintained communications across political boundaries through religious channels, and from various other sources including prisoners, deserters, and paid informants who could provide useful information about Ottoman capabilities and intentions. The intelligence that these networks provided, though inevitably incomplete and sometimes contradictory as medieval intelligence typically was, nonetheless gave Lazar significantly better awareness of Ottoman activities than Serbian rulers might otherwise have possessed, enabling more informed strategic decisions about when to prepare for potential Ottoman attacks and when diplomatic engagement might forestall military operations. The economic development that Prince Lazar promoted within his territories during this period reflected his understanding that military and political power ultimately depended on economic foundations that could generate revenues for supporting military forces, that could sustain populations capable of providing warriors and laborers, and that could create prosperity, making his rule attractive to subjects whose loyalty would prove crucial if military confrontation with Ottoman forces materialized. The prince's encouragement of agricultural production through stable governance that protected farmers from arbitrary taxation or seizure of property, His support for commercial activities through maintenance of secure trade routes and fair commercial regulations, and his patronage of artisan production that created valuable goods for both local consumption and export trade all contributed to economic vitality that strengthened his principality, while also providing resources necessary for military preparations. The economic competition between territories under Lazar's governance and regions that had accepted Ottoman vassalage or that had been incorporated into direct Ottoman administration created comparative evidence about how different political arrangements affected populations' material well-being, with this evidence sometimes suggesting that Ottoman governance provided security and commercial opportunities that compensated for the costs of tributary obligations and political subordination. 1379 to 1382 witnessed the progressive tightening of Ottoman pressure on Prince Lazar's principality as Sultan Murad. Having consolidated Ottoman control over Bulgarian territories and having brought numerous southern Serbian principalities under Turkish vassalage, turned greater attention to the central Serbian lands that Lazar governed, and that represented the most significant remaining independent Serbian power whose complete subordination to Ottoman suzerainty would establish Turkish dominance throughout the Serbian territories. The Ottoman military demonstrations along Lazar's frontiers intensified during this period, with Turkish forces conducting larger and more frequent raids that penetrated deeper into Serbian territory, and that demonstrated both the reach of Ottoman military power and the inability of Serbian defenses to prevent Turkish operations throughout regions that Lazar nominally controlled. The diplomatic communications between Ottoman representatives and Lazar's court became more explicit in demands for Serbian submission to vassal status, with Turkish envoys no longer accepting the ambiguous diplomatic language that had characterized earlier correspondence, but instead presenting clear ultimatums requiring either acceptance of specified vassal terms or preparation for military confrontation that Sultan Murad was prepared to initiate if diplomatic pressure failed to achieve desired outcomes. The military realities that Prince Lazar confronted in assessing his strategic options provided compelling evidence that prolonged military resistance against determined Ottoman conquest effort would ultimately fail, regardless of Serbian courage or defensive capabilities, as the disparity in available military resources, in organizational sophistication, and in tactical capabilities between Ottoman forces and what Lazar could mobilize created fundamental asymmetries that no amount of Serbian determination could overcome. The intelligence that Lazar's networks provided about Ottoman military preparations indicated that Sultan Murad could readily concentrate forces numbering 20,000 or more warriors for campaigns against Serbian territories, forces that could be sustained through sophisticated Ottoman logistical systems, and that included both the tactical expertise and the siege warfare capabilities necessary to reduce Serbian fortifications systematically, regardless of how strong individual defensive positions appeared. The Serbian forces that Lazar could mobilize from his own territories and from allied Serbian nobles who might support defensive operations probably numbered 8,000 to 12,000 warriors, at most, a respectable force that could defend against raids and that might achieve tactical success in favorable circumstances, but that could not realistically defeat a serious Ottoman conquest effort led by Sultan Murad personally and employing the full capabilities of the Ottoman military establishment. The diplomatic deliberations within Prince Lazar's court regarding whether to accept Ottoman vassal status involved intense debates among his advisors, among Serbian nobles whose territories would be affected by whatever decision Lazar reached, and among church leaders whose moral authority and religious perspectives significantly influenced how Serbian society would understand and respond to accommodation with Muslim Ottoman power. The arguments favoring acceptance of vassal status emphasized that submission would preserve Serbian governance structures, would protect Christian populations from the devastations that military conquests would inflict, would maintain orthodox religious institutions and practices under Ottoman guarantees that Sultan Murad's administration had generally honored in other vassal territories, and would provide time during which circumstances might change in ways that could enable eventual restoration of complete Serbian independence if Ottoman power weakened, or if Christian coalitions could be organized to challenge Turkish dominance. The arguments opposing vassal status emphasized that submission would represent betrayal of Serbian independence and Christian duty to resist Muslim domination, would establish precedent making eventual complete Ottoman conquest more likely as vassal relationships historically tended to evolve toward direct control, would require Serbian warriors to fight for Ottoman interests against fellow Christians in violation of religious solidarity, and would inflict moral and psychological damage on Serbian national consciousness that might prove as consequential as any material or political costs. The negotiations between Prince Lazar's representatives and Ottoman officials during 1380 produced a vassal treaty that formalized Serbian subordination to Ottoman suzerainty while preserving substantial Serbian autonomy in ways that reflected both Sultan Murad's strategic interests in minimizing administrative costs while maximizing control, and Prince Lazar's negotiating efforts to secure best possible terms given the unfavorable strategic circumstances that left him with limited bargaining power beyond the potential costs that military conquest would impose on Ottoman forces. The treaty required Lazar to acknowledge Sultan Murad as his suzerain through explicit diplomatic language and through symbolic acts of submission, to pay annual tribute initially set at relatively modest levels, reflecting Ottoman interest in making acceptance palatable and establishing precedent that could be increased subsequently, to provide military contingent of specified size when Ottoman authorities requested support for Turkish campaigns, and to coordinate foreign policy with Ottoman interests by foregoing alliances that might threaten Turkish strategic objectives. In exchange, the treaty guaranteed Lazar's retention of his throne and his governance authority over internal Serbian affairs, promised protection of Orthodox Christian religious practices and church properties, assured that Ottoman military forces would not operate in Lazar's territories as long as treaty obligations were met, and pledged Ottoman support for Lazar against potential threats from rival Serbian nobles or other powers whose aggression against his principality would be viewed as contrary to Ottoman interests in maintaining stable vassal relationships. The formal submission ceremony that marked Prince Lazar's acceptance of vassal status occurred with carefully choreographed symbolism designed to make clear the hierarchical relationship between Ottoman Sultan and Serbian vassal, while also preserving sufficient Serbian dignity that the accommodation could be presented to Serbian populations as pragmatic statesmanship rather than humiliating capitulation. The ceremony, likely conducted at an Ottoman military camp near the Serbian frontier rather than requiring Lazar to travel to distant Ottoman capitals, involved the prince presenting specified tribute payments to Sultan Murad or his representatives, declaring his acknowledgement of Ottoman suzerainty through a formal statement of submission, and receiving in return Ottoman confirmation of his authority to govern Serbian territories under Turkish overlordship. The symbolic elements of the ceremony, including the language employed, the protocol observed, and the gifts exchanged between the parties, communicated to witnesses and to broader audiences the political reality that Serbian independence had been fundamentally compromised while attempting to preserve forms and appearances that made the outcome more acceptable to Serbian society, whose support Lazar would continue needing for effective governance. The Serbian popular reactions to Prince Lazar's acceptance of Ottoman vassal status varied considerably depending on individual circumstances, their political sophistication in understanding strategic realities, and their priorities regarding whether preservation of Serbian governance and Christian religious practice under Ottoman suzerainty represented an acceptable compromise or whether national independence should be defended regardless of costs. The Serbian populations living in territories directly exposed to Ottoman military pressure and who had experienced or witnessed the devastations that Turkish raids inflicted generally viewed vassal status as a preferable alternative to military conquest that would bring far greater suffering while likely producing the same ultimate outcome of Ottoman dominance. The Serbian nobles and their retainers who had invested in military preparations and who identified strongly with martial values sometimes viewed accommodation as a shameful surrender that betrayed Serbian warrior traditions, regardless of the pragmatic arguments supporting submission. The Serbian Orthodox clergy and monastics generally supported Lazar's decision as serving the higher purpose of preserving Christian communities and religious institutions, even under Muslim political authority, framing accommodation as a temporary expedient that maintained essential Serbian spiritual and cultural identity while awaiting divine deliverance from the Ottoman yoke that faith promised would eventually arrive. The practical implementation of vassal obligations during the initial years following Prince Lazar's submission revealed both the significant burdens that vassal status imposed on Serbian territories and the comparative benefits of negotiated accommodation versus military conquest that other regions had experienced. The tribute collection process required the Serbian administrative apparatus to extract specified revenues from populations already burdened by taxes supporting Lazar's own governance and military forces, creating additional economic pressure that affected Serbian prosperity while enriching the Ottoman treasury. The military contingent obligations required Lazar to mobilize and dispatch Serbian warriors for Ottoman campaigns, depleting his own military strength while requiring Serbian soldiers to serve Turkish strategic interests that might conflict with Serbian values or allegiances. Yet these obligations, burdensome though they were, proved less destructive than the military campaigns, population displacements, and administrative disruptions that the complete Ottoman conquest typically imposed, creating pragmatic justification for Lazar's decision even as the moral and political costs of subordination remained subjects of ongoing debate within Serbian society. 1383 through 1386 witnessed the evolution of Prince Lazar's vassal relationship with Sultan Murad from initial arrangement negotiated under duress to more regularized system that established patterns for managing the complex political, military, and economic dimensions of Serbian subordination to Ottoman suzerainty while preserving substantial Serbian autonomy and internal governance and maintaining Orthodox Christian religious and cultural traditions that formed core of Serbian identity. The annual tribute payments that Lazar's administration collected and delivered to Ottoman authorities, initially set at levels designed to be sustainable without creating unbearable economic burdens, nonetheless represented a substantial wealth transfer from Serbian territories to the Ottoman treasury that funded Turkish military operations and administrative expenses while demonstrating Serbian subordination to concrete material obligations that recurred with yearly regularity. The military contingents that Serbian vassal forces provided for Ottoman campaigns during this period, numbering typically 1,000 to 2,000 warriors depending on specific Ottoman requirements and on military operation scale, fought alongside Turkish troops in engagements that sometimes targeted other Christian territories, including campaigns against Hungarian forces in northern Balkans and operations against Beria and its Holian opponents, creating moral complications for Serbian warriors serving Muslim Ottoman interests, while also providing them with military experience and exposure to Ottoman tactical methods that would prove relevant if eventual Serbian-Ottoman military confrontation occurred. The Ottoman supervision mechanisms that Sultan Murad's administration gradually implemented to monitor Prince Lazar's compliance with vassal obligations and to ensure that Serbian foreign policy coordination accorded with Turkish strategic interests demonstrated how vassal relationships inevitably evolved toward deeper Ottoman control, even when initial agreements nominally preserved substantial vassal autonomy. The Ottoman representatives who established a presence in Serbian territories ostensibly to facilitate communication and coordinate tribute collection and military contingent mobilization also served intelligence gathering functions, monitoring Serbian political developments, tracking Lazar's diplomatic contacts, and reporting to Ottoman authorities about any activities that might threaten Turkish interests or that might indicate Serbian preparations for resistance. The awareness that Ottoman officials maintained detailed knowledge about Serbian affairs through these monitoring mechanisms created deterrent effects that discouraged actions that might displease Sultan Murad, while also generating resentments among Serbian populations who viewed Ottoman presence as a humiliating symbol of subordination and as a constraint on Serbian sovereignty that contradicted the nominal autonomy that vassal status theoretically preserved. The Serbian military forces that remained under Prince Lazar's direct control after accounting for contingents serving with Ottoman armies faced restrictions and constraints that limited their size and capabilities in ways designed to prevent vassal states from building military power that might enable a challenge to Ottoman dominance while permitting sufficient forces for maintaining internal order and defending against minor threats. The Ottoman expectations regarding Serbian military strength, though not always formally specified in vassal treaties, nonetheless operated through a combination of explicit requirements to provide contingents for Turkish campaigns that depleted available Serbian forces and implicit understandings that excessive Serbian military buildup would be viewed as hostile preparation requiring Ottoman response. The fortification policies that Ottoman authorities gradually imposed on Serbian vassal territories similarly restricted defensive capabilities, with certain fortresses required to be dismantled or rendered less defensible to prevent their use in potential future resistance, while other strategically located positions came under direct Ottoman control or supervision to ensure they could not serve as bases for anti-Ottoman activities. The economic integration of Serbian vassal territories into broader Ottoman commercial and administrative systems created material dependencies that reinforced political subordination, while also providing some benefits that made accommodation with Ottoman power more tolerable for Serbian merchants, artisans, and farmers whose livelihoods depended on stable economic conditions and access to markets. The commercial relationships that developed between Serbian merchants and their Ottoman counterparts, facilitated by the security that Ottoman military power provided for trade routes, and by unified commercial regulations that Ottoman administration imposed across expanding territories, enable Serbian commercial activities to access larger markets extending throughout Ottoman domains and beyond, creating opportunities that independent Serbian territories might not have enjoyed while simultaneously making Serbian prosperity dependent on maintaining cooperative relationships with Turkish authorities. The agricultural production from Serbian territories that supplied both local consumption and markets in Ottoman cities generated revenues through transactions that benefited Serbian farmers while also demonstrating how economic interdependence could serve Ottoman political interests by creating constituencies within Serbian society whose material welfare aligned with stable Ottoman-Serbian relations. The Serbian Orthodox Church's role during the vassalage period proved crucial for maintaining Serbian cultural and religious identity, while also navigating complex relationships with both Serbian secular authorities and Ottoman overlords, whose policies toward Christian religious institutions combined toleration that enabled continued religious practice, with restrictions and interventions designed to prevent the Church from becoming a focal point for anti-Ottoman resistance. The church hierarchy, including the Serbian patriarch and influential bishops and monastic leaders, worked to preserve Orthodox traditions, maintain educational activities, support charitable works, and provide spiritual guidance that sustained Serbian communities through the challenges of living under Muslim political authority. The Ottoman policies toward the Serbian Church generally honored Islamic legal requirements for protecting Christian religious minorities and their institutions, with church properties typically exempted from certain taxes and with religious leaders accorded respect and autonomy in managing internal church affairs. Yet Ottoman authorities also monitored church activities to detect any support for resistance movements and occasionally intervened when they perceived church involvement in anti-Ottoman activities. The cultural production during Prince Lazar's vassalage period reflected the complex psychological and social dynamics of Serbian society, attempting to preserve its identity while accommodating political subordination to foreign Muslim authority, producing literary works, historical chronicles, religious art, and folk traditions that emphasize continuity with Serbian medieval glory while also addressing contemporary challenges of Ottoman domination. The Serbian literary activities centered in monasteries that served as repositories of learning and culture produced works that preserved the historical memory of independent Serbian kingdoms, that celebrated Serbian military and cultural achievements from periods before Ottoman expansion, and that provided religious and moral frameworks for understanding contemporary subjugation as a temporary tribulation that faith and endurance would eventually overcome. The folk songs and oral traditions that emerged during this period, transmitted through generations and eventually recorded in later centuries, created narratives about Serbian heroes including Prince Lazar himself, who resisted Ottoman pressure and who defended Christian faith and Serbian freedom even when faced with overwhelming odds, establishing cultural memories that would sustain Serbian identity through centuries of Ottoman rule and that would eventually inspire 19th century independence movements. The personal toll that vassalage took on Prince Lazar manifested in the psychological burden of governing under constraints imposed by Ottoman overlordship, in the moral anguish of sending Serbian warriors to fight for Turkish interests, in the political challenges of maintaining Serbian noble and popular support while implementing policies required by vassal obligations, and in the ongoing uncertainty about whether accommodation would ultimately preserve Serbian autonomy or would merely postpone inevitable complete Ottoman conquest. The prince's correspondence and the chronicles describing his reign during the vassalage years reveal a leader attempting to balance competing obligations to his Ottoman suzerain and to his Serbian subjects, to maintain Serbian dignity and identity while fulfilling requirements that compromise sovereignty, and to prepare for potential future confrontation with Ottoman power while currently serving Turkish interests as vassal ruler. The internal tensions that these competing demands created would eventually contribute to the resumption of open conflict that would culminate in the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where Prince Lazar would make the ultimate choice to resist Ottoman expansion despite understanding that military confrontation would likely result in Serbian defeat. 1387 through 1388 witnessed the progressive deterioration of vassal relationships between Prince Lazar and Sultan Murad as escalating Ottoman demands for increased tribute and larger military contingents, combined with growing Ottoman interference in Serbian internal affairs, and with changing strategic circumstances that created new pressures and opportunities, strained the accommodation that had preserved relative peace since 1380, and that created conditions where renewal of open military conflict appeared increasingly inevitable. The Ottoman pressure for enhanced tribute reflected both the expanding costs of Ottoman military operations on multiple frontiers and Sultan Murad's recognition that established vassal relationships could bear increased financial burdens, with requests for additional payments beyond originally negotiated amounts testing Serbian economic capacity, while also demonstrating that vassal arrangements existed at Ottoman sufferance and could be modified whenever Turkish interests dictated. Prince Lazar's resistance to these escalating demands, though carefully calibrated to avoid providing a pretext for Ottoman military action, while asserting that Serbian obligations should be limited to the originally agreed terms, created tensions that made the vassal relationship progressively more contentious and that suggested accommodation might not provide the long-term preservation of Serbian autonomy that acceptance of vassalage had been designed to secure. The diplomatic initiatives that various Christian powers explored during the late 1380s regarding potential anti-Ottoman coalitions that might challenge Turkish dominance in the Balkans created both opportunities and dangers for Prince Lazar, as participation in such coalitions offered theoretical possibilities for restoring Serbian independence while also risking Ottoman military retaliation if coalition efforts failed or if Lazar's involvement became known to Sultan Murad before defensive preparations could be completed. The Hungarian kingdom's diplomatic overtures to Balkan Christian rulers, including Lazar, exploring possibilities for coordinated resistance to Ottoman expansion that threatened Hungarian interests as Turkish forces advanced toward Hungarian frontiers, presented attractive prospect of powerful ally whose military capabilities might meaningfully alter strategic balance, while also requiring careful consideration of whether Hungarian support would prove substantial and reliable enough to justify the enormous risks of breaking vassal obligations and confronting Ottoman military might. The Bosnian rulers' similar diplomatic feelers, the Bulgarian princes' continued resistance in territories not yet completely subordinated to Ottoman control, and various other potential coalition partners' expressions of interest in coordinating anti-Ottoman actions created complex diplomatic landscape where opportunities for effective resistance appeared more plausible than they had since the Maritsa catastrophe, while the practical obstacles to organizing effective Christian unity remained as formidable as ever. The Ottoman intelligence regarding Serbian diplomatic activities and potential Christian coalition formation prompted Sultan Murad to increase pressure on Prince Lazar through a combination of heightened demands, military demonstrations along Serbian frontiers, and diplomatic warnings that any participation in anti-Ottoman coalitions would be viewed as a violation of vassal obligations requiring military response. The Ottoman surveillance networks that monitored Serbian activities provided Turkish authorities with information, though probably incomplete and sometimes inaccurate, about Lazar's diplomatic contacts with Hungarian and other Christian powers, about Serbian military preparations that might indicate planning for resistance, and about attitudes within Serbian society regarding whether continued vassalage or renewed resistance better serves Serbian interests. The Ottoman diplomatic communications to Lazar's court during 1388 became more explicitly threatening, with Turkish envoys making clear that Sultan Murad expected complete Serbian cooperation with Ottoman strategic interests, and that any detected disloyalty would provoke immediate military action that would transform Serbian vassal territories into directly administered Ottoman provinces while eliminating Serbian autonomy that accommodation had preserved. The internal debates within Serbian society and within Prince Lazar's court about whether to maintain vassal status despite escalating Ottoman demands and pressures or to prepare for open resistance that would almost certainly trigger military confrontation with overwhelming Ottoman forces revealed deep divisions about strategic priorities, moral obligations, and practical calculations regarding Serbian survival prospects under different scenarios. The faction favoring continued accommodation while acknowledging the increasing burdens and humiliations that vassalage imposed, argued that Serbian military capabilities remain grossly inadequate for successful resistance against Ottoman forces, that potential Christian allies' support would likely prove insufficient and unreliable as historically had been the case, and that breaking vassal obligations would result in catastrophic military defeat, followed by harsh Ottoman occupation that would eliminate even the limited autonomy that current arrangements preserved. The faction favoring resistance while acknowledging the overwhelming military odds against Serbian victory argued that continued accommodation would inevitably lead to complete Ottoman conquest as vassal relationships historically evolved toward direct control, that Serbian honor and Christian duty required resistance to Muslim domination regardless of material costs, and that even unsuccessful resistance would preserve Serbian dignity and would inspire future generations to continue struggling for independence, that accommodation would gradually erode beyond recovery. The military preparations that Prince Lazar intensified during 1388 suggested his movement toward a decision for resistance despite understanding the enormous risks and despite a lack of certainty regarding support from potential Christian allies whose promises remained vague and whose actual commitment to effective military action remained untested. The Serbian mobilization of military forces, the stockpiling of supplies and weapons, the strengthening of fortifications, and the diplomatic missions to coordinate with other Christian powers all indicated preparations for major military confrontation, while stopping short of explicit rejection of vassal status that would have immediately triggered Ottoman military response before Serbian preparations could be completed. The Ottomans' awareness of these preparations, gained through intelligence networks and through observations of visible Serbian military activities, created a situation where both sides understood that a crisis was approaching, but were neither yet wished to initiate open conflict before circumstances appeared optimally favorable, creating a period of intense tension during which any incident or miscalculation might precipitate the war that increasingly appeared inevitable. The Serbian Orthodox Church's support for Prince Lazar's movement toward resistance, despite the horrific costs that military confrontation with Ottoman forces would likely impose, reflected the Church leaders' conclusion that spiritual and cultural preservation of Serbian Orthodox Christian identity required political independence or, at a minimum, required resistance to foreign Muslim domination even when military prospects appeared hopeless. The religious framing that Church leaders provided for potential Serbian resistance, emphasizing themes of martyrdom for faith, of divine justice that would ultimately prevail despite temporary earthly defeats, and of eternal spiritual rewards for those who sacrifice lives defending Christianity against Muslim expansion, created ideological and psychological foundations for accepting catastrophic military losses that pragmatic strategic calculations would have rejected as irrational. The powerful sermon that Serbian Patriarch delivered at an important church council during 1388, preserved in subsequent chronicles and folk traditions, reportedly emphasized that Serbian soul salvation mattered more than physical survival, that temporary earthly kingdom under Muslim domination held less value than eternal heavenly kingdom promised to those who died defending Christian faith, and that Prince Lazar faced choice between preserving earthly power through continued accommodation or achieving spiritual glory through resistance that might result in martyrdom but that would serve higher purposes than mere political survival. The crystallizing determination that Prince Lazar reached during late 1388 to prepare for military resistance against Ottoman domination reflected complex combination of factors, including the escalating Ottoman demands that made vassalage progressively less tolerable, the potential support from Christian allies that made resistance appear possibly less hopeless than during previous years, the moral and religious imperatives that church leaders emphasized, the pressures from Serbian nobles and populations whose support Lazar needed and who increasingly favored resistance over continued submission, and perhaps the prince's own psychological need to assert Serbian independence regardless of material consequences. The decision represented not a sudden impulsive choice, but rather a gradual evolution from pragmatic accommodation that had characterized previous years toward acceptance that continued vassalage would not preserve Serbian autonomy, and that resistance offered the only remaining option for maintaining Serbian identity and independence. Even if military odds appeared overwhelming, and even if the likely outcome would be devastating defeat that might destroy Serbian power for generations. 1389 spring brought the final preparations for military confrontation that both Prince Lazar and Sultan Murad now recognized as inevitable, with Serbian forces mobilizing throughout territories that remained under Lazar's control while Ottoman armies assembled for a campaign that would punish Serbian disloyalty to vassal obligations, and that would demonstrate to other Balkan Christian rulers the futility of resisting Turkish demands. The military forces that Prince Lazar gathered for the approaching battle represented the largest Serbian army that could be assembled from territories not under direct Ottoman control, including Lazar's own principality forces. Contingents provided by Serbian nobles who joined his resistance, including his son-in-law Vuk Branković, despite Brankovic's own previous vassal arrangements with Sultan Murad. Allied Bosnian forces under Vaka Vuković, who recognized that Ottoman domination of Serbia would threaten Bosnian independence, and various other smaller contingents from Balkan Christian territories whose rulers calculated that supporting Serbian resistance served their interests. The total Serbian coalition army probably numbered 12,000 to 20,000 warriors, a respectable force that represented a substantial proportion of available Serbian military manpower, but that remained significantly outnumbered by Ottoman forces that Sultan Murad was assembling for. The campaign. The Ottoman army that marched toward Serbian territories during early summer 1389 reflected the impressive military capabilities that decades of continuous warfare and institutional development had created, combining numerical superiority with tactical sophistication, logistical organization, and combat experience that made Turkish forces exceptionally formidable opponents. Sultan Murad personally led this campaign, understanding its importance for demonstrating Ottoman power and for punishing Serbian defiance of vassal obligations in ways that would discourage other Christian vassals from similar resistance. The Ottoman forces probably numbered between 25,000 and 40,000 warriors, including elite Janissary infantry whose discipline and training made them devastatingly effective in battle, Turkish cavalry whose mobility and mounted archery skills had proven decisive in countless engagements, and contingents provided by Christian vassals, including some Serbian nobles who had chosen to maintain loyalty to Ottoman suzerainty, rather than joining Lazar's resistance, creating the bitter reality that Serbs would fight on both sides of the impending battle. The military disparity favoring Ottoman forces created realistic expectations that Turkish victory was highly probable. Yet Serbian determination to resist and the defensive advantages that Serbian forces might gain by choosing favorable battlefield terrain meant that Ottoman success would likely require serious fighting rather than being achieved through simple intimidation or overwhelming numerical superiority. The selection of Kosovo Poljes, the battlefield where Serbian and Ottoman forces would meet, reflected both geographic factors as armies maneuvered toward confrontation and strategic calculations about terrain that might favor one side or the other, with the relatively flat plain providing adequate space for large forces to deploy while nearby hills and features offered some tactical opportunities for positioning forces advantageously. The approach of the two armies toward this historic confrontation created the kind of psychological intensity that precedes major battles where participants understand that outcomes will prove decisive for broader strategic situations beyond immediate military results. With Serbian warriors preparing to fight for their homeland's independence and for Christian resistance to Muslim domination, while Ottoman troops prepared to demonstrate Turkish military supremacy, to punish Serbian defiance of vassal obligations that Sultan Murad's empire required from subordinate territories. Prince Lazar's final decisions about battle array, about tactical approaches, and about the broader meaning he attached to the confrontation regardless of military outcome, revealed his acceptance that Serbian forces likely would not achieve military victory, but that resistance itself served purposes transcending immediate tactical success or failure. The prince reportedly spent the night before battle in prayer and contemplation, seeking divine guidance and spiritual preparation for potential martyrdom that military reality suggested as a probable outcome. The speech that Lazar delivered to assembled Serbian forces on the eve of battle, preserved in later chronicles and folk traditions though exact words remain uncertain, purportedly emphasized that they fought for faith and freedom rather than for earthly rewards, that deaf and righteous cause defending Christian civilization against Muslim expansion held more honor and spiritual value than survival through continued submission, and that their sacrifice would inspire future generations regardless of immediate military results. This spiritual framing transformed military confrontation from purely strategic calculation into a moral and religious statement about Serbian identity and values that would transcend the battle's military outcome, and that would shape Serbian historical consciousness for centuries. The Battle of Kosovo that commenced on June 15, 1389, represented the climactic confrontation toward which Prince Lazar's vassalage period and his eventual decision for resistance had been building, testing whether Serbian military capabilities, combined with allied Christian support, could achieve victory that would preserve Serbian independence, or whether Ottoman military superiority would demonstrate the futility of resistance and would result in catastrophic Serbian defeat that would establish complete Ottoman dominance throughout the region. The engagement unfolded throughout the day with extraordinary violence and shifting momentum, with Serbian forces fighting with desperate courage that initially achieved tactical success in several sectors, while Ottoman numerical superiority and tactical sophistication gradually gained the advantage that would ultimately produce Turkish victory. The death of Sultan Murad himself during or immediately after the battle, assassinated by Serbian knight Miloš Obilić in circumstances that remain historically disputed, created dramatic element that elevated the engagement to legendary status in both Serbian and Ottoman historical traditions, despite not preventing Ottoman military victory that the Sultan's death could not reverse, given that Ottoman forces had already defeated Serbian army and that Murad's son Bayezid immediately assumed command and secured Ottoman control of the battlefield. Prince Lazar's capture and execution following the Serbian defeat transformed the prince from a political leader into a martyr whose sacrifice for Serbian independence and Christian faith would be commemorated in countless folk songs, religious writings, and cultural narratives that made him a central figure in Serbian national consciousness and a symbol of righteous resistance to overwhelming foreign domination. The prince's death, whether on the battlefield itself or through execution shortly afterward on Bayezid's orders, ended Serbian independence that Lazar had attempted to preserve through both accommodation and resistance strategies that circumstances it rendered inadequate against Ottoman power that military realities made overwhelming. The legacy of Prince Lazar's reign, encompassing both his pragmatic vassalage period that had preserved Serbian autonomy temporarily and his ultimate decision for resistance that resulted in catastrophic defeat, would be debated and reinterpreted by subsequent generations of Serbs seeking to understand their historical trajectory and to find meaning in the centuries of Ottoman domination that Kosovo's aftermath would establish throughout Serbian territories. The broader consequences of Kosovo and the failed Serbian resistance extended far beyond the immediate military defeat to encompass complete Ottoman subjugation of Serbian territories that would eliminate the nominal autonomy that vassal status had preserved, creating direct Turkish administrative control that would last for centuries until 19th century Serbian independence movements would finally restore Serbian statehood. The battle demonstrated that Balkan Christian powers lacked the military capabilities necessary to resist Ottoman expansion through military means, regardless of the courage or determination they displayed, validating Sultan Murad's strategic approach of combining military pressure with vassal arrangements that achieved Ottoman dominance while minimizing costs until circumstances made direct conquest advantageous. The historical memory of Prince Lazar's campaigns against Ottoman pressure, his difficult decisions about vassalage, and his ultimate resistance despite overwhelming odds would provide powerful narratives about Serbian national character and about the eternal struggle for independence that would resonate through Serbian consciousness across the centuries of Ottoman rule and into modern Serbian identity, making the 1370s through 1380s period not merely historical episode but foundational era in Serbian collective memory and national mythology.